Welcome back to the fifth installment of the Capital Conversation podcast. I'm James, this is Owen, and today we're going to be talking about the Pensacola shooting, the latest on impeachment, and new updates in the 2020 Democratic presidential race.
So this week's two sort of mass shooting type of situations at military bases. The first one being on Thursday at the Pearl Harbor base, where a gunman left two dead, and then he also perished himself. And the next one on Friday being a lot more notable due to its implications, and that was at the Pensacola Naval Air Station, and a Saudi national who was attending flight training was the one that was the shooter in this situation, and he left three dead before being ultimately shot dead by first responders, the sheriffs on the scene that killed the shooter. But the fact that he was a Saudi national caused many to consider this an act of terror. Representative Matt Gaetz, who represents one of Florida's districts, most notably said, this is not a mass shooting situation, this is an act of terrorism. And, this comes at a time where Saudi and United States relations have kind of been tumultuous and, kind of difficult because of the Jamal Khashoggi, murder or whatever you want to call that from last year. And
It was a murder.
Right. The fact that they killed many civilians during the Yemen civil war with their airstrike. And so the U.S. has been put in kind of a sticky situation because, they are very much a strategic ally considering their position over there in the Middle East. And, that's somebody that we give a lot of military aid to, but the regime and, MBS and all them have been making it kind of difficult to support them lately because of some of the actions that they take themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that when it comes to that area, the U.S. doesn't have many options. They have the Saudis, who they've sort of fallen back on as being a military presence in the area, but beyond that, they're pretty much hated by everyone. So, like with the Jamal Khashoggi thing, Americans clearly weren't happy about it, but they just sort of had to stomach it because there aren't any other options. And this is another instance where you're like, this is probably warrants a response of some sort, but how far can we go without completely wrecking our presence in the area? And beyond that, there's economic implications, as the Saudis are one of the biggest importers of oil into the United States as well. So there's a lot going on here, and it's an important political and just calculation, I guess is what it is at this point, is how far you can go to sort of admonish the Saudis and how much you can ignore it, and to what extent you let that go before you put your foot down and say, this is unacceptable, you have to stop it. And is it worth it in the long run as well, with regards to the economic implications and the strategic military implications? So these are the things that the United States has to measure, and ultimately, based on a lack of action we've seen so far, I think they're sort of putting it on the back burner and saying it's more important that we keep that relationship good than punish them for maybe one rogue act that wasn't associated with them. And I personally don't like that. I would like to see some sort of sanction go in place or a slap on the wrist, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen.
Well, you can draw a little bit of distinction between this situation and the Khashoggi situation simply because, U.S. intelligence feels pretty certain that the order to kill Jamal Khashoggi came down from MBS, Crown Prince.
Yeah, and this was a rogue act, and I guess I get that, but at the same time, how many, you say, this was that, how far do you let this go?
We don't know right now whether it was a rogue act or not, but, the administration at least has been apologetic. They reached out to President Trump immediately to express their condolences, say that he doesn't reflect, the ideals and beliefs of the Saudi people, but it just complicates the situation. And, to provide some more context, the U.S. removed their, military aid and support from the Saudis after the Khashoggi incident, and then after Iran has been starting to act more roguely and militantly in the area, sinking oil tankers and stuff like that, and really attacking the Saudis, the U.S. was forced to kind of bring back their military presence because when it comes down to supporting Iran, supporting Saudi Arabia, it's an easy choice for the Americans that Saudi Arabia is more closer reflective of U.S. ideals and the people that they kind of need to team with to prevent Iran from being a powerful, nuclear and militant presence. They don't want this Iran situation to bubble out of control and, further add to the tumultuous region that the Middle East already is. So they were forced to, go back to supporting Saudi Arabia, which, might be in question in light of the situation, but it was already a rocky situation between the U.S. and the Saudis, and so, this kind of adds to that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make. If the relationship wasn't already sort of on edge with regards to the Khashoggi thing and how they've handled, there's been a lot of tension with the oil. The Saudis don't like that Americans are using their own oil and cutting back on that, so there's that economic tension as well. And I think if there wasn't any of that background, this would just be a simple act of terrorism, not reflective of the Saudis. The apology would be accepted and we could move on. But it's just it just adds on to what's already sort of unstable but necessary, as the United States don't have any other options to
Right.
keep the Iranians in check. So I
And
don't
the
know how.
Saudis have a reputation for harboring, terrorists against the United States. That they hosted something like 7 out of the 11 9/11 people that carried out the attack,
Yeah.
and were
Well, and the
high ups.
Saudis
And
weren't happy that the United States is allowing families of 9/11 survivors to sue them
Right.
in international court. So there's that as well. There's just been a lot lately that's sort of shaken that relationship, and that makes this. I mean, I don't want to say small because people died, but in the grand scheme of things, diplomatically, it wouldn't be a huge deal if it weren't for the context that's already in place. So I think that's important to remember, and it's why this is getting so much attention, I think.
Right, and it also raises questions like, it certainly is suspicious that a Saudi national was attending flight training in the United States in Pensacola, Florida, as opposed to undergoing training in his home country. So, it certainly leads to, a necessity to be investigated by the United States about, was this guy gathering intelligence or something of the sort, and was he acting on behalf of the Saudi Arabian government, which would certainly make things a lot more complicated in their relationship. I mean, right now there are a lot more questions than there are answers about the shooting itself, but it's certainly something that leads to needs to lead to further investigation, considering the circumstances as they stand currently.
In long term, I'm sure the United States will look more closely into and vet Saudi nationals who come into America more, and that will undoubtedly increase the tension there as well, as the Saudis will be like, you don't trust us as a whole nation because one guy did this, and then that could escalate as well. And again, given how rocky the relationship is right now, it's anybody's guess how that pans out ultimately. But it's just interesting to see how one little thing can sort of bubble over very quickly. And I think that this situation in itself is pretty small and can be handled diplomatically, but there's an opportunity for it to turn into something big, as the United States could really turn a necessary ally into, I don't want to say an enemy, but someone that they don't want to work with. And that has huge implications in the Middle East as well,
Right.
and economically in America, just because
as
of
far
the
as
oil.
trade goes.
So this small incident by one guy, who might not even be associated with the Saudi government at all, at least in this act, beyond the fact that he was here for flight training, could turn into something huge. And that's something the Americans have to consider when responding to it. And I think that's why we haven't seen any, I mean, there's been statements, but there hasn't been any punitive action against the Saudis. So I think it's more of a strategic
Right.
move, as opposed to they don't want to do anything.
But it also is something to consider that this did happen, on Friday, and information about the shooter wasn't out until Friday afternoon, late Friday. So just because we haven't seen any punitive action thus far, it's Sunday right now, this happened on Friday, that doesn't mean that anything is not forthcoming. But first of all, we know how slow government works, and then second of all, even if government was acting as fast as possible, there really hasn't been time, considering the
and I
days of
think-
the week that have passed, for action really to be taken. So I think we'll see a more calculated and measured response from the United States on Monday, just in terms of a statement, and then more so going forward. But this is a rare situation in United States foreign policy where the United States actually does need Saudi Arabia, maybe not as much as Saudi Arabia needs the United States, at least to help with their economy and with, fighting their enemies in the Middle East. But the United States certainly needs to have Saudi Arabia as an ally because of all that they're able to provide for the United States. So it's not one of the situations where the U.S. can just say, screw you, we're going to find another ally, or, we're strong enough to work on our own. Like, they really do need the strategic partnership of Saudi Arabia, and that's why we've seen now for tens of years, the United States kind of be afraid to act on some of the misdeeds of the Saudi Arabian government.
And I think the fact that the Americans or the United States know that the Saudis need them maybe will help convince them that this was a rogue act. Like, why would the Saudis ever do this? Given the climate in the Middle East, they know that they need the United States more than ever, so it really wouldn't make sense for something to happen at this point in time. Now, if relationships were a little more stable, or there had been like a blockbuster, huge just eruption in the relations between the Saudis and the Americans, I mean, maybe you could see something like this being an act of retribution. So even though it was a little bit unstable, it doesn't seem like this would be a response to anything in particular.
Well, if it's ordered down from the Saudi Arabian government, then this is an act of war. I mean, there's no other way to classify it. And I think it's highly unlikely that that was the case.
Yeah, just given how badly
But it would
the
be an
Saudis
act of
need
war.
them.
I mean, they killed, military officials for the United States. They killed naval officers. So there's no question that then at that point it's an act of war, which would have extremely damaging repercussions. And, there's like a 1% chance or less than that that's actually what happened. But, it certainly is not something that either side wanted to happen. I think it's a fair way to classify
I think that's why it's fair to say that this guy was probably acting on his own, like you said, just because there's no real upside for the Saudis in doing this.
But it's not unfeasible to, suggest that the Saudis have the audacity to do something like this. I mean, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi basically proves that. I mean, they basically said, like, we're going to kill this guy that speaks out against our regime because we don't like him, and he speaks out against our regime as a reporter for the Post, and you can't do anything about it because you need us, and you can't violate international law. And, I mean, they basically called the United States' bluff. I mean, I don't really want to call it a bluff, but, they challenged the United States, and they were right. The United States really couldn't do anything about it, and I think a lot of people are unhappy with the way that the Khashoggi situation was handled and felt like, justice has not been served for that man, and that's probably accurate. But, it's a tough situation for the U.S. I mean, there's not an easy solution to that problem.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this pans out in the next few days. But coming back to the home front, Devin Nunes testified on Monday regarding a 123-page House Republican rebuttal to the impeachment inquiry the Democrats have been putting on in the House. And this is the first time we've seen Republicans as a unified front publicly defend Trump's actions. So the report, while it was thorough and cited multiple instances, the gist of it was that they are taking the stance that nothing illegal or illicit happened in the conversation with Trump and President Zelensky in Ukraine, and that Trump was acting in his official capacity to prevent corruption and investigate it, and that that's what he was supposed to do. And then after that report came out, Nunes testified, like I mentioned, and when questioned, he said he spoke of criticisms about the impeachment process as a whole and said Democrats were doing it incorrectly beyond the fact that it shouldn't be happening at all. He attempted to reframe the context of the phone call. As somebody who wasn't involved in the phone call or the dealings with Ukraine, besides the legal professors, he's the first sort of layman who's come out and spoke about this. And he tried to make the call seem routine and just something that happens in politics and not anything out of the ordinary. And then he tried to make the whole thing seem like a ruse and that it was pre-planned and that this was going to happen regardless of what evidence came out. The quote that sort of sums that up is what Noon said to the House: "What you're seeing in this room over the past 2 weeks is a show trial." And then he goes on to say that everything against Trump was pre-planned and vindictive, and that they were going to do this regardless of what was said on the call, just for the negative publicity. And it was pretty damning. He was pretty convincing, I believe, and it's going to be interesting to see how that affects the numbers coming as a Republican to testify who wasn't actually involved in the call. So it's pretty interesting to see, one, how the Republicans decided to defend this. Are they saying it's not an impeachable defense at all? Are they saying something happened, but it's not impeachable? So just to sum up one more time, they say nothing illegal or illicit happened, and that the whole thing is a ruse, which is shocking for me because I thought they would say, yeah, it looks a little shady, but it's not impeachable. I thought that was what they would say. But they've come out in the report and said, not only is it not impeachable, there's nothing to look into at all, which is what the president's been saying all along. So it's just interesting to see how those align with each other.
And on the other side of the coin, the Democrats and their kind of outline for the future articles of impeachment that will be drawn up, they've, cited the fact that the Constitution states treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, and so they've kind of pointed to that, like constituting the withholding of aid as a bribe, like $400 million of aid. We give you that, you give us this, dirt on Trump's political rival, and then they've also attacked him for abuse of power in office and obstruction of Congress or obstruction of justice, which ties back to the whole Yovanovitch deal and Trump.
Which is why I find it surprising that they're saying nothing at all happened, because I think there's enough evidence for everyone to say something happened. It's just the extent to which he should be prosecuted for it. But to say nothing happened, I think, is a bit outlandish. It's like just denying the whole thing happened makes the Republicans seem a bit more unreasonable than the Democrats, and I don't think that's the look they really want to go for.
Right, but the Democrats have kind of gotten caught up in this, difficult situation where they're trying to weigh, whether or not they are isolating their articles of impeachment to this specific instance with Ukraine, or if they're going to kind of broaden it in terms of the whole Trump presidency. If they're going after abuse of power in office, then there's a lot of things that they can point to that even are outside of this whole Ukraine situation that may kind of pile up to be okay, your exercise of presidential power greatly exceeds what the Constitution states, and so as a result of that, we think that it's right to remove you from office because you've acted inappropriately.
And I think that's convincing.
Right.
Recently, they had, I think it was over 500 legal professors, constitutional scholars, and renowned lawyers throughout the country sign a petition saying that, or a statement, not really a petition, that what Trump did was impeachable. And these are 500 of the brightest legal minds we have, all sort of coming to a consensus here. And granted, it's not all of them. There's probably some, I haven't seen the numbers on that say it's not, but just the number of people saying that this happened and it's impeachable makes it sort of even more incredulous that Republicans would come out and say nothing at all happened when everybody seems to agree that something bad went on. So I think it just makes them look bad, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. Although I can also see it puts them in a tough place because the president the whole time has been saying nothing happened, nothing happened, nothing happened. And as a party, you want to represent sort of a united front to the people and have one stance on the issue. And it would be a little weird for the president to say nothing happened and then his own party to double back on him and say, well, something did happen, but it wasn't bad enough for this to happen. And it just makes it complicated. So I can see the political motivations behind it. But I was hoping that they would sort of come back to center here and be moderate and appeal to independence and say, look, something happened. It might not be impeachable, but I think we need to look into it further and sort of counterbalance the president in the mind of voters, and that clearly isn't happening. So it's going to be interesting to see how that affects the next election cycle, as moderate voters might say, it might be a little outlandish at first for the Democrats to launch all this and make a big deal about it, but the Republicans aren't appealing to me either because they are sort of going the opposite direction. So in my mind, the Republicans really missed an opportunity here to appeal to voters.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a strategic predicament for both sides because, as we all know, the whole impeachment process relies in large part on public opinion. And, the Democrats, while they might have a stronger case, I think you and I can see that.
Yeah.
If they say, from the time that Trump entered office in January of 2017 to now, he's done these, tens of things that have exemplified abuses of power in office, and even before he actually attained the presidency or in that transition period, there are many things that they can point to. There's plenty of things outlined in the Mueller report that they can speak to as abuses of power, abuses of office, but it's a lot harder to make your pitch to the public when you're kind of all over the place versus presenting like one cohesive,
Yeah.
kind of argument that's like, okay, this is the situation, these are all the facts, there's no nuances, you can understand completely where we're coming from. And so, they kind of have to weigh like which one is the best strategy in terms of like currying public favor, and do they think that they can get the Republicans to come around. But it's probably an easier path to, get Republican votes to pull the whole, abuses of power argument and talk about like, here are all these things that Trump did that a president shouldn't do, and you guys being limited government people, like not really wanting like if a president to have all this power, should understand our argument that like this is an outrageous stretch from what the Constitution intends for a president to be, and so therefore you should vote for us.
Yeah, and last time we were evaluating whether Pelosi would send this to the Senate at all, given that it seems increasingly unlikely at this point that Trump's going to actually be impeached. And, you said that she could pull it out and tell the voters, we tried, we presented the evidence, we think it's impeachable, but we don't see a path from here, so it's up to you to vote him out in the next election. And I think we agreed that would be pretty convincing. But on Thursday, Pelosi confirmed that they are submitting the articles of impeachment and they are sending it to the Senate. So that sort of puts that to rest.
Yeah,
and,
no, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It would be probably a good strategy for her, but, on the other side of the coin, there is that whole, like, embarrassment in the media. Like, if you try and impeach a president and then you completely fail, like, Trump is just going to tweet out and constantly kill them about, like, they tried to get me with this witch hunt, blah, 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 and they completely failed. They had nothing the whole time. Total exoneration.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to see. A month ago, you had Republicans kind of queasy, like maybe something bad happened here, and you had Democrats saying, maybe something bad didn't happen here, and it seemed like everybody was sort of on the fence, and now you have Democrats putting their foot down and saying, we're taking this to impeachment, and you have Republicans submitting their 123 paper about how nothing bad happened, and instead of having everyone say something bad happened, it's just a question of is it impeachable, we've seen shift further to the left and the right, and now we've got yes and no, and it seems like there's nothing in the middle, and that's kind of indicative of how the country's moved, like the voting population has moved throughout the course of the Trump presidency, in that it's become so much more polarizing, and it's gotten to a point where it seems like nobody can even look at it and say, all right, I can see this happened, but I'm arguing that this,
right.
It's just this, and you have to pick a side, and I think it's sad that that's going into government the way because in the past, you've seen politicians sort of meet in the middle and make concessions and agreements, and the public's always been a little polarized over the past few years, but now it seems like that's creeping into to Congress, and that's a scary thing, I think.
Right. But, there was kind of one shift towards the more like moderation, non-partisan-ish, like, playing nice at least to the other side. The event that we saw recently regarding this whole impeachment situation was, there was a big push by congressional Republicans to subpoena Schiff's phone records and kind of go on the offensive with like calling Biden in to testify and people like that in their trial in the Senate, and really like go after like corruption and misdeeds in the process by the Democrats and during this whole impeachment situation. But Lindsey Graham and several other Senate Republicans just said plainly, like, no, we're not going to do that. We're not subpoenaing Schiff's phone records. We're not doing any of that. We're going to focus on President Trump, and we're not going to make this like a puppet show trial. We're going to get into the facts of whether or not he did something that was impeachable, and that's going to be the situation. We're not going to play party politics.
And I thought that was exactly the right thing to do, trying to keep this as formal and bipartisan as possible, just unearth the facts and have a real vote instead of all of this polarization, which I think will ultimately skew the results of the vote.
And considering how partisan Lindsey Graham has acted recently, it was kind of a welcome surprise to see that be his response. But
and I think you'd see most people like that and support that, and you'd think if the people would support that, why wouldn't more politicians do it? So it's kind of paradoxical in the sense that everybody, you see one instance of sort of an agreement happening and the people support it, yet there's no more after that. So I just find that kind of perplexing within itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, both sides overwhelmingly say, like in polls that we've seen, I mean, Pew Research is the one that predominantly does this stuff, but, both sides feel that their side and the other side should compromise more than they do. And,
Yeah.
there's just disparity between parties, but both parties are above 50%. A majority of people in both parties think that there should be more compromising,
Yeah.
but we don't see that.
Yeah. All right. Well, switching gears a little bit to the Democratic primary race. This was a pretty big week in terms of that. We had a candidate two candidates drop out, and then we had a front runner get into a pretty testy argument with an Iowa voter, and that front runner being Joe Biden. A self-identified non-Republican Iowa farmer went to, I guess it was a town hall.
Yeah, he's a Warren supporter.
Oh, Warren supporter that showed up at Biden's town hall, and it started off with him sounding reasonable and just asking him about Ukraine and Hunter Biden, which has always, or lately, has been something he's gotten a lot of questions about. And then, admittedly, the guy started getting terse with Biden, and instead of handling it,
Well, he told him he didn't have a backbone.
instead of handling it with the grace and glib that a politician, at least I was hoping would, not sort of steeping down to that level, Biden, he didn't scream, but pretty loudly into the microphone goes, "You're a damn liar, man," cuts him off, and then just sort of descended into, got in the mud with the guy and started challenging his intelligence. Biden even said that if he wanted to do a push-up competition, he would be down. He would run a race against the guy and take an IQ test. He was belittling the voter the whole time and ended it by saying, "You're too old to vote for me anyways, I'm not even going after you." And while it made both men look bad, 100%, I think we can both agree that the farmer doesn't really care what people think about him. Whereas Joe Biden, I think it was a terrible look for the guy, even though some people are, sort of celebrating it like...
Well, the people that were at his campaign event were certainly, on Biden's side, applauding his response and all that. But those are not the people that are showing up at Biden's campaign events and are ardent supporters of his are not the people that he's trying to drum up to win this nomination and to win this presidency. He needs the moderate voter, the independent voter, that group in the middle that can be swayed away from voting from President Trump to voting for him. And, the whole Democratic Party's campaign and Biden's campaign has kind of been like, this guy doesn't have the character to be president and the temperament, and we don't like how rude he is to people that don't support him, and, how he's constantly on the offensive and belittling people and all that. And so, it's not a good look when you're campaigning against somebody that acts in this way and you're criticizing him for those attributes to then, someone that doesn't agree with you to be that standoffish and off-putting towards them. And so I think that people aren't going to like to see that from Biden. They want to see more grace and elegance from him than they're seeing from President Trump, and that's a reason to vote for the guy. And so if you take that away, that really hurts his kind of...
And even character-wise, just the fact that a random Iowan farmer can get under his skin so easily is concerning. I mean, I've never been in a diplomatic meeting before, but I would imagine keeping your cool and maintaining composure and making level-headed decisions and comments is important. And he clearly showed that he has trouble doing that.
Well,
when
not
asked
only
about...
that, but if you think about, he's going to have to be, if he wins the nomination, he's going to have to be on the stage with President Trump 3 times for 2 to 3 hours. And Trump is going to have a lot more critical and worse things to say than the Iowa farmer did.
Oh, he's going to say the exact same thing. He's going to say Hunter's corrupt, and
Right.
Biden's going to flip out. And
So if Biden can't keep his composure on the debate stage against Trump, that's a serious concern for Democratic voters that I think they have to consider when they're deciding whether he's the right candidate to nominate. Because you can say what you want about Hillary Clinton, but when Trump told her that he was going to put her in jail when he won the presidency, she did not react angrily or vociferously. She went after his temperament like one should, and kept her cool on the stage. And if Biden's not capable of doing that, that's going to hurt him in front of the voters.
And beyond that, it's not... I mean, even the fact that he was so aggressive towards the guy is one thing, but what he said was also pretty insulting. While we don't know for sure, there's certainly a plausible way to interpret what he said is calling the guy fat. He made several references to the man's weight. He challenged him to a push-up and running competition. I mean, it's not like he was defending himself. He was just making an ad hominem attack on the man. And while it was a loaded question and he did accuse Biden of not having a backbone, it also is somewhat telling that he completely ignored the allegations, and instead of giving a nice response like, yes, this might look bad, but here's what actually happened, or I wasn't involved, or one of these things, instead of defending
Right.
the merits of the argument, he immediately just goes after the guy and challenges him to an
and
IQ
he said
test.
no one has ever accused him of wrongdoing or his son of
Yeah.
wrongdoing, which is just plainly wrong. I mean, I think that a lot of people agree that there are some more answers to the questions, related to that whole situation, and what President Trump did in regard to Ukraine was not right. And, getting Hunter Biden involved in this impeachment thing is undeniably the wrong path for Republicans to take. I mean, this situation is completely outside of that, but there still are some questions about what exactly happened with Hunter Biden and with Vice President Biden when he was in the Obama administration. And to say that no one's accused him of wrongdoing and that he acted completely in the right in that situation is just plain wrong based on what we know thus far. And I think a lot of Americans and plenty of Democratic primary voters have some questions about that situation. I mean, the whole progressive movement has been like, that anti-nepotism, anti-corruption, like the insiders get all the roles and stuff like that. So, that's something that he should want to talk about and want to clear his name about if truly there was no wrongdoing. And the fact that he got so offended by it suggests that, it is possible that something is being covered up there. And I don't think Republicans are handling the situation the right way, but he's not helping himself by also handling the situation the wrong way.
Yeah. Well, it's also important to note that as the impeachment hearings have drawn out, President Trump has certainly been hurt, but Joe Biden has as well, and that's not as frequently talked about. But
Right.
his polling numbers have slipped, and I think most people can agree that Hunter Biden getting paid $83,000 a month for doing nothing on an oil and gas board is a little shady at best, and
Yeah.
maybe even I think it's investigatable. I don't think it's Trump's place to ask Ukraine to invest it, but I do think that something wrong happened there. And like I mentioned, Trump's numbers have certainly gone down throughout this, but Biden's been slipping as well and losing his base, not a ton, because people who vote for Biden are pretty loyal to him. The black vote, for example, hasn't shifted it all away from him. But it's just a matter of how much can this go on for before it starts to really hit him in the polls. And you've been seeing a slip over the past few months, and then he shows something like this where he just flips out at a guy who makes one comment about his son within a 30-second period, and it's like, how much do these voters need who are so loyal to him to start to flip over to another candidate? And it's been a bad couple months for him in terms of publicity.
Right. And, speaking to the whole polling situation, like I saw one recently by Cal Berkeley, and we had previously seen some polls by Survey USA and a couple of other pollsters in California that had Biden up by even double digits in California, which is obviously a huge state in the Democratic primary. And now they had Sanders up by, I think it was 2 points. And so, losing losing California, where he previously held a large lead, would be a huge detriment to the Biden campaign, considering how many delegates, that state holds. But also the fact that this, Iowa farmer was a Warren supporter and Democratic primary voter, has huge implications for the Biden campaign, because these are the people that he now, if he were to win the nomination, needs to centralize and bring together behind his campaign. And if you're alienating these people and saying I don't want you to vote for me, and it's a Democratic Party member, a Democratic primary voter that doesn't have Biden as his first choice, he still ultimately needs to gather those votes together if he wants to win the presidency.
Yeah, and so something else that might be important is he said, just in sort of a last little jab at the guy, he said, "You're too old to vote for me anyways." But I think that as an older American who might be considering voting for Joe Biden, I would find that off-putting, in that he said, my vote, he's not even trying to get my vote.
The whole Democratic Party's crusade against the old white man is, that's not going to help, considering how frequently those people vote.
Yeah, they're the most likely voters.
Help them in the general election.
Yeah, they're the most likely voters, and a lot of them are unhappy with what Trump's doing. Older Americans at this point in time tend to be far more Republican, but I think there's certainly an opportunity, given the current political climate, for the Democrats to take some of those votes away. And insulting older Americans like that is really not a smart thing to do, especially And it's ironic in the fact that Joe Biden is one of the oldest presidential candidates we've had in a while.
Right.
But,
But the future of Social Security is, a hugely concerning and important issue to, those elderly voters, and especially the white voters, just because like they've been more likely, based on like average income and stuff like that, to buy into the program at a higher rate and have expected much higher returns, just statistically. And so, those people want to ensure that they're going to receive the benefits that they've paid for all these years and been promised. And so I think that they see that as being in a lot safer hands with the Democratic Party, just considering the whole attachment to welfare and all that stuff. So, that whole future of Social Security should give the Democrats an in with those, elderly white voters, and belittling and saying that those people don't matter because, they're not an identity politics group is not a winning strategy in terms of the election.
Yeah, and I saw some Quinnipiac data last week that showed the age of age of likely voters for each Democratic candidate, and the younger progressive vote does not go to Joe Biden. His base is not 20 to 30, but more sort of a middle-aged American,
right. Well, those
who's
are the
more
moderate Democratic
which
primary
is
members.
makes it even more striking that he would, like, if Warren or Sanders said something like that, their base is younger, so I could see how that even might make sense. But for Joe to even slightly put off an older American is shocking. And the guy wasn't even that old. I mean, he looked like he was probably 50 or 60 to me. It's not like he
Well,
was...
he's slightly older than Biden is. That's what he said.
He was?
That was part of his question. Was he said,
Oh.
I'm concerned about like some of the things that you said publicly. Like he was mentioning the gaffes and talking about his temperament, and he said like, you're almost as old as I am, and that kind of concerns me. That like, I feel like I'm too old to be president. I don't feel like I'm competent enough at this point to, like, have the mental capacity to hold an office that has that much importance. And so that whole age thing like concerns me in terms of the fact that you're almost as old as I am, and I can like totally understand that whole age thing. And again, that's another like legitimate question that maybe wasn't phrased in the most polite manner towards Biden or something like that, but it's a valid concern that a lot of people hold, and it's a question that he needs to be able to answer gracefully and elegantly so that people, those concerns get alleviated. And we talked in the last podcast about how impressed we were in the debate with like how Buttigieg handled the questions over like concerns with his like his record and how qualified he is for the job, like what he's done in the past. And he did a great job of answering that question, didn't get offended by the question, understood that that was a concern that voters have had for him, and was actually pleased at the opportunity to kind of speak out against that whole like rhetoric against him. And it should be the same thing for Biden. Like if people are only concerned about Biden's age and the Hunter Biden situation, then that's an easy opportunity for him to kind of, flip that like Reagan did back in 1980 and, get the voters to no longer be concerned about it.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the uncomfortable questions for candidates are what end up tipping elections.
Yeah.
Like, if he did or did not, help Hunter Biden sort of corrupt the U.S. government with regards to Ukraine, I think that's a big, point for a lot of voters. And the age thing as well. I saw something a few weeks ago that said 30% of Democratic voters are worried about the age of the field. And I think if he can convince Americans that those two things are, I don't want to say false, but not as big a deal as everyone's making them out to be, it becomes much more likely that he ends up being the president. So being able to calmly and coolly answer those questions is critical, I think, to him assuming the presidency. And the fact that he seems unable to do so is telling for his campaign and his future in politics. Because I think you're with me here, this is Joe's kind of last hurrah. I think he's too old. I think he's too old now, but I think he would even concede that this is sort of his last chance to make a name for himself. And it's not it's not a start, but it's not looking good for him right now, given the fact that he can't answer those questions, like you said, eloquently and coolly with facts. And like, he just goes to ad hominem attacks, and that's going to put off a lot of voters, given the importance of those questions.
Right. So switching over to another candidate in the primary, Kamala Harris, Senator Kamala Harris, recently suspended her campaign this past week for the presidency. And so that kind of opens up, a 6 to 8 point hole in terms of like that's the support that she was holding. If you look nationally or at various states, I mean, she was kind of in that range of 8 to 6 points. And so that opens up an opportunity for someone to assume that percentage. And considering how tight it is at the top with Biden, Warren, Sanders, and Buttigieg, centralizing that percentage can in a lot of ways shift, several states, national polling, stuff like that. And so, it's big news in that regard. And also in terms of like, what is Senator Harris angling towards now? Like, where does she go from here? And she's a middle-aged female senator, and I don't think she wants to spend the next 20 years of her life in the Senate. I think she's dreaming bigger than that.
Yeah, she is.
But
I think her voting, like, I don't want to say her base, but I guess it's her base, is she was really vying for the younger, people of color vote, and now that that's open, it's going to be interesting to see which candidate they gravitate towards.
But again, like, that's what she was vying towards, but in a lot of ways, like, her candidacy was not successful because black voters never really supported Kamala Harris. She never really was able to, like, gather that vote behind her. And, I don't know if that was a mixture of, like, you had Booker in there, you had her, it could be that. It could also be the popularity that Joe Biden has within those communities due to his attachment to President Obama, but she never really was able to gather that vote. So her supporter was just kind of, it was a mixed bag, really. Like, I don't know that you can really generalize about, like, this is the type of the supporter that X candidate needs to now put their campaign behind in order to grab her support. But, it certainly opens up a gap and room for someone to trend upwards in the polls. But it also had implications in terms of the diversity of the Democratic Party field. A lot of Democratic voters were upset because of her dropping out to see that now the 6 candidates that are qualified for the next debate are all white and
old. Well, not all of them old, but a lot of them are old, and a lot of them
but
are
they're
men.
all white. And so that, they weren't really pleased considering how diverse the field started, that now it's down to 6 white people.
Yeah, and if you look at the mobilization of the Democratic Party, when it comes to winning the election, I think at this point, it's not all about turnout, but turnout's a big piece of it. And in order to win, they really need to turn out minority voters. And given, again, like you said, the lack of diversity at the top of the field, I think it's not a huge blow, but it certainly throws in another hurdle for them to surpass.
Well, and that matters to a lot of Democratic primary voters, so I think that they're discouraged. Like, they were excited to, have the most diverse field in a primary in history, and they wanted that to continue, and for that to be, like, the future of their party, and now they're stuck with a bunch of people that just on the basis of, like, the boxes that they check, their identities, that they don't really, like, want to be the picture of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and I think Kamala had a pretty, like, if you had to just hand pick somebody to be a candidate, I think if you take sort of the subjective pieces out, she was a pretty good pick. She's a seasoned senator. She's a woman of color, and I think that is appealing to a lot of Democratic voters. But at the end of the day, her personality doesn't really lend itself to warming people's hearts and convincing them to get out.
Her record hurt her. I mean, that was highlighted by Tulsi Gabbard on the stage, but she also was hurt by, like you said, like, the way that she campaigns, her personality, and then also she never really was firm and, it planned well in terms of her policy positions. I mean, she constantly went back and forth on healthcare, and I think that really hurt her.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's huge.
The thing that's working for Pete and Biden, and then on the other side of the coin for Sanders and Warren, is where they stand, and you either agree with one or the other. But one day, Warren was a universal health care, progressive, and on the other day, she didn't want to take people's existing health insurance away from them. And so, like, people not knowing where she stood on that, I think, leads to difficulty, because if you're someone that is a universal health care person, you're better off just supporting Sanders or Warren because you know where they stand. And if you're someone that wants to keep your private health care, you're better off supporting Pete or Biden because you know where they stand. And, if you support Harris and that's a big issue to you, then you really have no idea which policy she's actually
Yeah.
going to go after.
And it's
so-
a big issue to everyone. I think healthcare, immigration, and guns are probably the three most important voting issues in this election cycle. So, like you said, the ambiguity surrounding her position on that is pretty big. But at the end of the day, she's young. She has a lot of potential in politics. She's pretty aggressive and offensive, and she speaks well, I think. And I think there's a lot of potential for her to be a leader for the party in the future. So this is probably more of a learning experience for her, learning how to handle herself on a national stage, and navigating how to become a president is going to ultimately benefit her in the long run.
I could see her running again. I don't know if 2024 is the year for her.
Yeah,
if
no, I don't think-
Trump wins re-election in 2020, I don't know that she tries again immediately in 2024. But if a Democrat wins the presidency, I could certainly see her, navigating for that attorney general job, and I could see any one of the front runners picking her for that. I think, she has the qualifications for it, and
Yeah, and her temperament sort of the few
leads to that.
Yeah.
And I think she would do well with the job in terms of like what the Democrats would want her
Yeah.
to do. And
She's certainly qualified to do
Right.
it as well, and she's got the name recognition that
yeah.
sort of lends itself
And so
to
maybe, if a Democrat wins in 2020, she can serve in that post for 8 years, and then that feeds into a future run after that.
Yeah, but I think what she's learned maybe from this is she needs to get the minority vote, and she needs to be a little less aggressive and off-putting. And if she has 8 years to, maintain the public eye and sort of change that stuff about her, I think she could be a pretty viable candidate
Right.
in the next 10 years or so. So I think she'll probably look back at this at the end of her career and say, yeah, I didn't win, but it was necessary for me to do whatever I do next.
Well, it can certainly be a good learning experience if she wants to run again in the future, because there were a lot of things that she did wrong this time around, aside from just like things about personality that you can't really change. I mean, the next time that she runs for president, if she chooses to do so, she needs to come in with a firm plan and like actually have a researched and rehearsed course of action. And with her staff members kind of fleeing and being disappointed with the campaign, like that was a lot of the complaint, was like, this whole campaign is like all over the place and not well planned. And if she can clean up some of that, then I think she'd have a much more successful campaign.
Yeah, I think so too. At the end of the day, I think she'll look back on this not as a victory, but as a necessary step to advance her political career. And I mean, if she ends up assuming the AG or running for president again, then I think she would view this as a positive step, and not so much as a failure as much as an older politician would, who's in the same situation. Like if Bernie loses this or Warren loses this, it's kind of like the last straw for them. They don't really have another crack at it as far as I see it, but I think Kamala's in a different boat in that she was testing the waters here. She's going to learn from her mistakes, and hopefully she'll be a better politician as a result. Well, thank you for joining us today on the Capital Conversation. It's going to be interesting to see how everything pans out with regards to Saudi Arabia, the election cycle, and impeachment. And we'll see you next week on the 6th installment.